After losing his sixth Oscar nomination, Leonardo DiCaprio woke up to the same nightmare every night. When he first told Oprah about it, there was such fragility in his voice that everyone in the studio couldn't hold back their tears. "In my dream, I keep walking onto the stage, but nobody applauds," he said, and even Oprah held her breath. In that moment, everyone understood that Hollywood's brightest star was actually battling his darkest fears. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Harpo Studios, casting long shadows across the familiar set where Oprah had conducted thousands of interviews. The golden light seemed to dance across the burgundy chairs, creating an intimate atmosphere that had witnessed confessions from world leaders, broken hearts from global superstars, and revelations that had changed millions of lives. The studio crew, veterans of countless emotional interviews, moved with quiet reverence, sensing that today's conversation would be different from the usual promotional appearances and carefully managed celebrity encounters. But today felt different. Today, Leonardo DiCaprio sat across from her, his hands folded tightly in his lap, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something raw and unguarded. The makeup artist had applied the standard television touches, but they couldn't mask the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of years spent chasing something that seemed always just beyond reach. The man who had commanded the screen in Titanic, drawing tears from audiences worldwide, who had mesmerized viewers in The Departed with his complex portrayal of duality, who had brought profound depth to every character he touched, looked smaller somehow. The expensive, tailored suit couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders, and his trademark smile, the one that had graced countless magazine covers, was notably absent. Instead, there was something almost child-tiled in his expression, vulnerable and searching. Oprah noticed it immediately. In her 3 decades of interviewing the world's most powerful people, she had developed an instinct for reading the unspoken pain behind polished facades. She had seen this particular brand of suffering before, in CEOs who had built empires but felt empty, in artists who had achieved fame but lost themselves, in leaders who had conquered the world but couldn't conquer their own doubts. Leonardo's eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had captivated millions on screen, carried a weight she recognized all too well. It was the burden of never feeling enough, the invisible prison of perfectionism that so many successful people built around themselves, without even realizing it. There was something in the way he sat, slightly forward, as if ready to flee at any moment. His breathing was careful, controlled, the breathing of someone who had learned to manage anxiety through sheer will. Even his stillness spoke volumes. It was the stillness of someone holding something fragile, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the carefully constructed composure he had spent years perfecting. "Leo," she began, her voice gentle but direct, "you've been nominated for an Academy Award 6 times. You've given performances that will be remembered for generations. But sitting here today, I sense something deeper going on. Talk to me about what success really means to you." Leonardo shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. The question hung in the air between them like a bridge he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. He had been asked about success countless times before, had given the polished answers about craft and storytelling and the privilege of working with great directors. But something about Oprah's presence, something about the way she waited in the silence without rushing to fill it, invited a different kind of truth. Her eyes held no judgment, only an invitation to step into authenticity, a space where the carefully constructed persona could fall away, revealing the tender humanity beneath. "You know, Oprah," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've spent most of my career feeling like I'm auditioning for something I can never quite reach. Even when the cameras stop rolling, even when the reviews are good, there's this voice that says it's not enough, that I'm not enough." The confession hung in the air like morning mist, delicate and revealing. Oprah leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his face. She had interviewed presidents and moguls, survivors and stars, but she knew that this moment required something different. This wasn't about extracting sound bites or creating television magic. This was about witnessing a soul in its rawest state. "Tell me about that voice," she said softly. "When did you first hear it?" Leonardo's breathing deepened, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might retreat back into the safety of celebrity polish. But then something cracked open, something that had been carefully guarded for decades. I was 12, he said, his voice gaining strength through vulnerability. I was on the set of Growing Pains, and I overheard someone say that I was just another pretty-faced kid actor who would never make it as a serious performer. I told myself I would prove them wrong, but somewhere along the way, proving them wrong became the only thing that mattered. That comment became the soundtrack of my entire career, a constant whisper in my ear during every audition, every take, every award ceremony. I remember walking home that day, feeling like someone had ripped something essential out of me. I was just a kid who loved acting, who felt alive when I was pretending to be someone else. But suddenly, that joy became conditional. I couldn't just act anymore. I had to act perfectly. I had to be extraordinary. Anything less felt like failure. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, the memory still sharp after all these years. I think that's when I learned to split myself in two, the Leonardo who felt everything, and the Leonardo who performed perfectly. And for the longest time I forgot which one was real. The cameras captured every micro-expression, every pause, every moment of recognition that passed between them. This wasn't just Leonardo's story anymore. This was every person who had ever felt the crushing weight of not being enough, every dreamer who had turned their passion into a prison of perfectionism. Oprah nodded, understanding flooding her features. So you've been chasing something external to validate something internal. And the Oscar became a symbol of that validation. Exactly, Leonardo said, and there was relief in his voice. The relief of being truly seen. Each nomination felt like I was getting closer to proving I belonged, and each loss felt like confirmation that maybe I didn't. But as the conversation deepened, something unexpected began to happen. The vulnerability that had started as a trickle became a river. Leonardo began to speak about the nights after award ceremonies, sitting alone in his Malibu home, staring at the ocean and feeling emptier than he had before the nominations were announced. The waves would crash against the shore in their endless rhythm, but inside him, there was only stillness, the kind of suffocating quiet that comes when you realize that everything you thought would bring you peace has left you feeling more fractured than before. He talked about the dreams that plagued him, not just the one about the silent applause, but others too. Dreams where he was on movie sets, but the cameras wouldn't work, their lenses cracked and reflecting back distorted versions of himself. Dreams where he was delivering his lines with perfect precision, but no sound came out, his voice stolen by some invisible force that seemed to mock his efforts. Dreams where he was reaching for something just beyond his grasp, something golden and shimmering that represented not just professional recognition, but the deeper validation he had been seeking since childhood. The recurring nightmare about the stage, he added, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. It's always the same. I walk up those steps, feeling the weight of the gold statue in my hands. But when I reach the podium, the entire auditorium is empty. Not silent, empty. Echo chambers of red velvet seats stretching into darkness, and I'm standing there in my perfectly tailored tuxedo, holding this award that suddenly feels meaningless because there's no one there to witness it. No one to finally say, yes, you belong here. That's when I wake up, usually around 3 a.m., drenched in sweat and feeling more alone than I've ever felt in my waking life. The night after the 2014 Oscars, he continued, his voice growing steadier as he shared more of his truth, I sat in my car outside the Vanity Fair party and cried. Not because I didn't win, but because I realized that even if I had won, it wouldn't have filled the emptiness I felt inside. That's when I knew something had to change. Oprah felt the familiar stirring in her chest, the recognition of a story that could change lives. This wasn't just about Hollywood or awards, or even success. This was about the universal human experience of seeking external validation for internal worth. What did that realization feel like? She asked. Terrifying, Leonardo admitted, because if the Oscar wasn't going to fix me, then what would? I had built my entire identity around this pursuit, and suddenly I was questioning everything. The studio grew even quieter, if such a thing were possible. Even the crew, accustomed to emotional moments on the Oprah show, seemed to be holding their collective breath. There was something happening here that transcended entertainment, something sacred and healing. That's when I started therapy. Leonardo continued, surprising himself with his openness. Real therapy, not just the kind where you talk about your latest project or manage public relations crises. I mean the kind where you sit in uncomfortable silence until the truth bubbles up from places you didn't even know existed. My therapist asked me one question that changed everything. When you imagine yourself as worthy of love, what does that feel like? And I realized I had no idea. I had never allowed myself to imagine being loved for who I was, flaws and all. The work was brutal. We traced patterns back through generations. My grandfather's need to prove himself as an immigrant, my father's artistic struggles, my own desperate climb up the Hollywood ladder. I learned that perfectionism isn't really about excellence. It's about fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of being seen as ordinary. And I had been running from ordinary my entire life, not realizing that there's extraordinary beauty in simply being human. One session stands out in particular. I was describing a panic attack I'd had after a particularly harsh review, and my therapist asked me to close my eyes and imagine that 12-year-old boy on the Growing Pains set. "What would you say to him now?" she asked. And I broke down completely, because all I wanted to do was hold him and tell him that he was already enough, that he didn't need to spend the next 30 years of his life trying to prove his worth to strangers. That moment was when I understood that healing isn't about fixing yourself. It's about learning to love the parts of yourself that you thought were broken. Oprah smiled, the kind of smile that had reassured countless guests over the years. "And what did you discover?" I discovered that the 12-year-old boy who heard those words on set never really grew up. He just learned to hide better. Every role I took, every performance I gave, was really that little boy saying, "See, I am good enough. Please love me." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and for a moment it seemed as though he might stand up and walk away from the interview entirely. The weight of such raw honesty was almost too much to bear under the bright studio lights, in front of cameras that would broadcast his vulnerability to millions. Oprah noticed the moment of hesitation, the way his body tensed, as if preparing for flight. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to an almost whisper. "Stay with me, Leo. You're safe here. This is exactly where you need to be." Her words were like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in their own truth. The revelation settled over the studio like a gentle rain. This was the moment Oprah had been waiting for, the crack in the armor that allowed light to pour in. "And now, how do you feel about that little boy?" Leonardo paused, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm learning to love him. The broken parts, the scared parts, the parts that will never be perfect. I'm learning that maybe that's enough." As the interview continued, Leonardo shared more about his journey towards self-acceptance. He talked about the meditation practice he had begun, the way he had started choosing roles not for their Oscar potential, but for their ability to teach him something about himself. He spoke about the relationships he had damaged in his pursuit of perfection, and the ones he was working to rebuild with honesty and vulnerability. But perhaps most importantly, he talked about the night he finally won his Oscar for The Revenant. "Standing on that stage," he said, his voice full of wonder, "I realized that the applause I had been chasing was already inside me. It had been there all along." The award was beautiful, meaningful even, but it wasn't what healed me. The healing came from accepting myself before I won it. I remember looking out at that audience and feeling, for the first time in my career, that I belonged there not because I had finally proven myself, but because I had finally stopped trying to prove myself. The speech I gave that night wasn't the one I had rehearsed. It came from a place of gratitude, not validation. I thanked my mother, the indigenous communities, the planet, all the things that had shaped me beyond my career. In that moment, I wasn't Leonardo DiCaprio, the actor, seeking approval. I was Leonardo DiCaprio, the human being, expressing genuine appreciation for the journey that had brought me to that stage, wounds and all. Oprah nodded, tears visible in her own eyes. "That's the real victory, isn't it? Not the external recognition, but the internal peace." "Yes," Leonardo said simply. "The peace of knowing that you are enough, exactly as you are, in this moment, not because of what you've achieved, but because of who you are." The conversation began to wind toward its natural conclusion, but the impact was clear. This wasn't just Leonardo's healing journey anymore. It was a roadmap for anyone who had ever struggled with perfectionism, anyone who had ever tied their worth to their achievements, anyone who had ever felt that crushing weight of never being enough. As they prepared to wrap, Oprah asked one final question. What would you say to someone watching this who recognizes themselves in your story? Leonardo looked directly into the camera, his eyes clear and bright with hard-won wisdom. I would say that you are enough. Right now in this moment, with all your flaws and fears and imperfections, you are enough. The love you're seeking, the validation you're chasing, it's already inside you. You just have to stop running long enough to feel it. And I want you to know that the voice telling you that you're not good enough, that you need to be perfect to be loved, that voice is lying. It's the voice of old wounds, old fears, old stories that no longer serve you. You don't have to carry those stories anymore. You can write a new one, starting right now. A story where you are the hero, not because you're perfect, but because you're brave enough to be imperfect. Because you're courageous enough to be real. Because you choose love over fear, again and again, especially when it's hard. The studio erupted in applause, but this time it was different. This wasn't the polite applause of a television audience. This was the sound of hearts opening, of recognition, of collective healing. In sharing his deepest vulnerabilities, Leonardo had given everyone permission to embrace their own. As the camera stopped rolling, Oprah reached across and took Leonardo's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for your courage, for your truth, for showing us all what real strength looks like." Leonardo smiled, the kind of smile that comes from deep inside, untouched by performance or pretense. Thank you for creating a space where that was possible. In the days and weeks that followed, the interview would be viewed millions of times. Comments would pour in from people sharing their own struggles with perfectionism, their own journeys towards self-acceptance. Teachers would show clips to their students. Therapists would reference the conversation in sessions with clients struggling with similar issues. Parents would sit down with their children and have conversations about worth and achievement that they had never known how to start. But beyond the public impact, something more personal and profound had occurred. In that moment, in the quiet of the studio as the last light of afternoon faded through the windows, there was just the simple recognition of two human beings who had found healing in the space between vulnerability and grace. The crew, usually quick to pack up and move on to the next project, lingered longer than usual, as if reluctant to break the sacred space that had been created. Oprah herself would later describe this interview as one of the most transformative conversations of her career, not because of any revelation about fame or Hollywood, but because of the universal truth that had been spoken, that our worth is not contingent on our achievement, that our value is inherent, that love is not something we earn but something we already possess, waiting to be recognized and embraced. The little boy who had been wounded on the set of Growing Pains was finally heard, and in being heard, he was healed. Not because he had proven himself worthy of love, but because he had remembered that he had always been worthy of love. The standing ovation he had been seeking his entire life wasn't coming from an auditorium full of strangers. It was coming from within his own heart, finally ready to applaud the imperfect, beautiful, completely enough human being he had always been. Sometimes the greatest performances happen not on movie screens or award show stages, but in quiet moments of truth between souls brave enough to be vulnerable. Sometimes the most important applause is the kind that echoes in the silence of our own acceptance. And sometimes the role that matters most is simply being ourselves, perfectly imperfect and beautifully human. In the end, Leonardo DiCaprio's greatest performance wasn't in any movie. It wasn't even winning the Oscar that had eluded him for so long. It was in that studio, in that moment, when he chose to be real instead of perfect, when he chose healing over hiding, when he chose love over fear. That's when the 12-year-old boy finally got his standing ovation. Not from Hollywood, but from his own heart. Finally ready to come home to the truth that had been waiting there all along. He was already enough, had always been enough, and would continue to be enough, no matter what.